Hi everyone, welcome back to a new virtual Eclipse community meetup. I'm your host, Laura Tran, and I'm here to introduce our guest speaker today, Xiaomi Bresson, who will be presenting about the Eclipse MicroProfile OpenAPI. If you have any questions, please leave them in the Ask a Question tab below your screen, or you can drop them in the chat box as well. Over to you, Jeremy.
Okay, thanks you for joining me for this presentation. So I'm Jeremy, I'm living in France, working in Switzerland, and I'm a Java developer. I'm working for OnBlue. We are doing a collaboration and a communication suite. On the right, you see our messenger module. And related to the topic of today, with the new version of OnBlue, we will introduce the possibility for our customer to plug their own bot. The bot is responsible for the conversation onboarding, and the API that our customer will use to plug in their bot, it's written, of course, with OpenAPI. Our customer, they are typical banks or insurance, and they use our solution to help their customer. Another interesting module that we have is co-browsing solution. Like co-browsing is being able to share content or sharing the same web page between two persons. And in our case, our customer are using our solution to instrument their e-banking application, for example, and then the agent are able to help the user of the e-banking. So on this demo, I have instrumented the Eclipse Wiki. So I'm not sure if the Eclipse Foundation will set up an assistance team for the Eclipse Wiki, but if they would, they could install our software to help the user and the Eclipse community to show them how they can edit content on the wiki. So this is, of course, a joke because I'm not sure if the Eclipse Foundation will use this tool, but what is interesting is that it's a pure JavaScript solution. So the customer, the visitor of the e-banking application, they do not have to install anything. They can just click on Help Me, and then the agent can help them, can chat, or can co-browse the web page to help them. But back to the topic of today, it's about Eclipse MicroProfile OpenAPI. So first, I wanted to just take the three terms apart and say a few words about the Eclipse Foundation. A lot of you might know Eclipse for the Eclipse IDE, but the Eclipse Foundation is much more than that. It's about having a place where several companies can run their open source project. They offer all that the developers need in order to run their open source project. And they are doing so since a long time because the Eclipse IDE is now many years old. And recently, other projects has joined the foundation, and we have now several working groups, and we have also a lot of successful projects that are totally unrelated to the Eclipse IDE. The second term used in the title is microprofile. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the microprofile, what it is about. So just this slide to explain. It's about adding some missing parts to the JavaEE, or now JakartaEE framework. So the idea is that in the same spirit than JakartaEE, several additional implementation are proposed and shared and implemented then by different vendors. The idea is really the same than for JavaEE. You have an API, you have a specification, and then you have several implementation. The goal of those smaller specification is to provide a good cloud, good solution for the cloud development. So you have some stuff such as circuit breakers or metrics and stuff like that was or or that is not yet present in the JakartaEE, but then you can use kind of microprofile on top of JakartaEE to have all the missing pieces. Now, a few words about OpenAPI. If you just remember one thing, this can be this picture. Like OpenAPI is the contract between a client and a server when there is a REST API. Maybe you heard from Swagger before. Like Swagger and OpenAPI, it's all the same. It's about it changed the name when Swagger was donated to the Linux Foundation. So Swagger, this is a brand that is kept by Smart Beer, and the tooling still exists. But the standard that was created out of Swagger is now called OpenAPI. But basically, it's just the next version of Swagger that is called OpenAPI when it's come for the specification. And now Swagger is a tool that deals with OpenAPI, and you have many other tools also using OpenAPI as a standard. Concretely, it's a project on GitHub, so you can see how the specification is developed, and you have many issues where people are discussing what could be added to the specification. And then they do some releases with a new version of this specification. What is important to understand is that OpenAPI is a standard, and this is why you have really a large ecosystem around it. You have projects that do documentation or editor, text editor, or GUI editors. You have generators to generate code. You have really a lot of tools that you can use when you are using OpenAPI. When I started to deal with this topic, it was about 2 years ago. I had no idea about OpenAPI, and then I started to read about that, and then I discovered, oh, OpenAPI, it's really everywhere. Each time I open a new project I see, or a new tool, I see that they publish their API in this format. Like this is an example with Jira. We are using Jira in our company, and they have like an OpenAPI specification that they provide. Another example is OpenShift. We are also using OpenShift for our customer that prefer this solution over Kubernetes. And of course, also there you have a project with a lot of contributors that have just written a Swagger or an OpenAPI specification. Last example, I was reading the Eclipse Planet, which is aggregating some news from all the Eclipse projects. And this is a news from Eclipse Cura. I'm really not using that because I'm not in this IoT space. But then at the middle of the article, I've noticed, oh, now I see they also use OpenAPI to describe the API that you can use somehow with the IoT devices. So concretely, an OpenAPI specification, this is nothing more than a JSON or a YAML. You can use both formats. And they describe what can be done with the API. So this is more or less how it looks like. And the main section is this path section, where you will find all the endpoints that are available. So here, for example, you have kind of a way to retrieve one task from this small to-do backend application. You have the HTTP method that you can call on this path. And then you have the parameters. You might have a request body for post requests, for example, and you have a description of the response that you might receive if you call this URL. If you have parameter inside your path, you need to specify them. And this is also an interesting topic. If you are sharing the same schema between multiple endpoints, you can store them into another section, which is called components. And there you have a map of schemas that you can reuse between different entry points. So this is the example with our to-do object, which has some properties. And of course, for a to-do application, you can imagine that you can create them, retrieve them, update them, and so on. Then some example about the tool. So historically, there is the Swagger UI, which is an HTML representation of the same specification, like the YAML or the JSON file. And this is also interesting because you have this try me or try it button. So you can also perform some REST call from inside the HTML page. An alternative to Swagger UI is Redoc. This is the same idea. You do not have the client part, but this is another framework to document or to generate documentation that corresponds to your specification. Then, if you need to edit the specification, you can use Swagger Editor. This is an online editor that I can show here. I have the same specification that I have already shown about the to-do application. And here I can edit, modify the text, and so on. And this gets reflected on the right. The to-do to create. And here you see that the description is updated. And I can see, oh, here I can use this to retrieve the list of to-dos. I have a small example. This is really convenient to work with. If you prefer working inside your IDE and if you are using Eclipse, then you can install this plugin into your IDE and you will get an editor. There is no preview like with Swagger UI, but this is also really convenient because we'll have some error markers, you will have some completion, you can do some refactoring, renamings, and so on. This is based on Xtext for the people that know this framework. Then sometimes people are more looking for a solution with buttons because they do not want to care about what they should write in the YAML or the JSON file. So this is an open source project that is kind of a studio for editing and creating OpenAPI specifications. So this is the same idea, but now you have more like forms that you can use in order to write your specification. And what is interesting with this tool is on each page you can click on source and you will see the YAML content that corresponds to the page you are looking at. So you can either see the complete specification or just now, if you are editing one specific endpoint, you just see the source for that endpoint. And you can edit the source and then go back to design. This works perfectly. So sometimes it's more quicker to just edit a YAML file, but sometimes it's also good to be able to being able to add a description and to have the YAML updated. Another example of a tool that is using OpenAPI, this is OpenAPI Generator. The idea there is that you take your specification and then you can generate some code, some HTML documentation. And with code, it can be a client to connect to the server, or it can be also a server stub that can be used then to develop or to have a starting point when you are developing a server. So now, like, what is MicroProfile and what is the OpenAPI project inside this MicroProfile galaxy of framework? So the idea is that in the Jakarta on JavaEE world, we have Jax-RS to write some REST endpoints. And the MicroProfile OpenAPI project will come on top of that in order to document the endpoints and in order to provide this missing part between like the Jax-RS and the specification. Let's start with a demo. I have prepared a small demo that is based on Quarkus. So Quarkus is one application framework that implements the JavaEE, JakartaEE specification. So you can pick an existing backend, and we will see how we can add the missing part in order to get the OpenAPI specification. So let's switch to the terminal. So what I need to do, I'm now in the project. I need to start Quarkus, and this will start the JavaEE server. And this is one demo application that people speaking about Quarkus are using a lot. So if we switch to this tab, we can see this small application running. So the Quarkus part is about the backend that manage these small to-do application that you might have seen already. So this is a project somewhere on GitHub where everybody is implementing the same UI and the same backend with different technology. So I can test this and create a new task, marked it as done. And the Quarkus part, of course, is the Java backend that serves this UI. So now let's say we would like to see the OpenAPI specification for this backend. So for that, the Quarkus has an extension that is prepared, so I can just stop the server and add an extension that is called OpenAPI. So they have a Maven command to do that. So I just say, okay, I would like to add the OpenAPI specification, the OpenAPI specification to this to-do backend application. And already I can restart my server. And the application, if I navigate back, the application, should work. This is some demo effect. So the project is live, and now if I navigate to, I was too quick, but now the application is running. It's the same application than before, so nothing has changed for the user. But for somebody that would like to understand what are the endpoints available on this server, I have a new page that is available with in the development mode. So now Quarkus is started as a development mode, and I have a new page that is Swagger UI. And this is, if you remember Swagger UI, this is a UI representation of the this is an UI representation of the specification that is currently served by this server. I can also open another URL, which is localhost 8080/OpenAPI. And here I see the specification as a YAML content. So I see that I have some endpoints. So if you look at this specification or its UI counterparts, you see that a lot is empty. And this is because we have added the OpenAPI capacity to the Quarkus application server, but the Quarkus application or the code has for the moment no information about what each endpoint is doing. Like all the documentation is missing. And this is where the annotation defined in the microprofile project can be used. So you can go to the code and where you can go to the code and you can add some like some annotation to the code. So I have prepared it because I do not want to type that now, but the idea is quite simple. I would explain that with the slides later. You just add some new annotations telling that what each operation is doing. So now, because Quarkus, I can check out this revision. Oh, I need to remove that, and will do the checkout. So now I'm using this code, which is the same than before, just the annotation were added. And now I think my server is still running. So if I go back to the Swagger UI, I refresh, and then Quarkus has noticed the change, and with some hot reload, I can just like view the modification that I've made. So the annotation are providing the missing description, some example for each endpoint, and now my specification or its UI representation is much more complete. So if I reload it, you see much more information than before. For the people that do not like the annotation way of documenting the API, there is an other alternative that I've prepared as an alternative commit. So this commit will just remove the annotation from the code and will add an OpenAPI YAML file that is the documented specification with all the explanation, the summary, the descriptions, and stuff like that. So basically, I can let's do it like this. I can like check out this version where I have no annotation and no file. So now my specification is kind of empty. If I want to document it, I can load it like this and edit that to add some description where it's missing. So let's do this. I check out this commit. Now this file is added. And here I've disabled the annotation. I will explain that later. And when I reload, I get the explanation, the description, and so on. And here I have a much more complete OpenAPI specification. So this is it for the demo now. Let's switch back to the presentation. So just with a picture what we now did during the demo, we took an existing application, which was this to-do application served by the JavaEE, JakartaEE Quarkus backend. Then we have added the microprofile, and we have seen two different ways of adding the microprofile, either with annotation or with a file added to the application server. And now the server is capable of serving the specification. Oh, and what I did not do, but I can do that now for the like as an extra topic for the demo. I can import this in some tool that understands this format. Like I forgot to do this part, but if I switch back to Insomnia, which is a REST client, I can go somewhere here to import, and I can say I would like to import, like this is the file, the same file generated by the server. I have just saved it before. I click on import and I say I would like to import that. And now, in order to test, this is also really convenient. And in our daily job at OnBlue, we use that a lot. If you have an OpenAPI specification for your server, then you can you have immediately some tools that are capable of asking the question just with this client. So I'm a little bit confused because now I need to specify a base URL. So I will just copy that. Sorry about that. And okay, I don't remember how I have set up the I have okay. Manage environment, sorry. So here I can set some value for the base URL. This is the part that is missing. Sorry about the confusion, but now as the specification was imported, there is a placeholder called base URL. I just need to configure that. Of course, like importing a collection is not something you do every time. This is why I just skip this part. And now I was expecting to be able to retrieve the content. Okay, I'm not sure what I've missed here, but localhost. Oh, probably I need to remove this slash send. Okay, so now kind of I have a way in order to debug or for QA, and this is where I was saying that we use that a lot at OnBlue. If you have the OpenAPI specification, you can use a tool like this or like Postman in order to be able to ask for the endpoint and in order to be able to test. So you have also the possibility to create new to-dos and stuff like that. Okay, so back to the presentation now. So this is really convenient to be able to import that, and then you have an alternative client. This might be useful in order to debug. So this is the end of the demo. And just as a recap, like what we have done, you have two solutions that you can use to document your API. The first one is using the annotation. And this is great because it's directly in your code, but the code is somehow verbose. So you might prefer using the static file approach where you just need to edit the YAML file, but then it's up to you to keep the Jax-RS annotation in sync with the OpenAPI specification that you are documenting, where you put your documentation. So the annotation, I told you I will do a little focus on that. So here, those are the Jax-RS annotation that you might already know. And this is why I told you it's a little bit verbose. This is what you need to add in order to add the documentation, in order to create the OpenAPI specification. And this is the alternative. As an alternative, as I have shown in the demo, you can just take the OpenAPI YAML file as it is served, and then you type all the missing parts, and then you add this file to your meta-inf folder. And I recommend, if you do so, to disable the annotation scanning, because otherwise, well, you have two sources, and of course it's working because they are combined together, but I would say that if you do like the file-based documentation, it's preferable to not inject the Jax-RS annotation when you are serving the specification. But you are free to not use this setting if you think that the merge makes sense in your case. So, and by definition of the specification, of the microprofile specification, to get the OpenAPI specification from a server that is implementing this spec, you can, there is a new URL that you can call, which is /OpenAPI. You can specify if you would like to receive the JSON or the YAML format, and then you get the specification based on some rules. So this is why I told before that you need to decide the strategy that you will use. So you have a way to create an initial model. Then the static file that you can provide is parsed and added to this specification. Then, depending on the configuration, you have the Jax-RS annotation that are parsed and added to the specification. And you have the possibility to add an additional filter to manipulate the result. And the output of this filter will be the specification that is served by your server. Another interesting stuff that is present into this specification is
Sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
but we do have a question for you.
Okay.
So it's which has precedence, static file or annotations if both are present?
Yeah. Okay. This is a great question. So You can read that more in detail in the specification, but this small bullet point list that I've put here on this slide is basically the order. Like, it's really an ordered list. In the specification, you have some text that describe that more in details, but this is really like, first, this model reader is used, and by default, I think that you have an empty model that is created. Then you have the file, then you have the annotation, and you can also interact with the result with a filter that you can provide. So it's really like this order that is implemented by or defined by the spec, and then implemented in each of the implementations, such as Quarkus or other app server. I guess this answered the question. If not, feel free to continue the discussion. Another thing that is interesting in this microprofile specification is that you get some models that define the content of an API specification. You have some builder pattern in order to create your own objects, and what you get is a typed representation of the JSON or of the YAML file, and it's much more easier to navigate with this typed approach than parsing or reading the YAML file manually. So the models, the interfaces, they are defined in this package. And this is kind of an example of you can create by code now an OpenAPI specification. So you recognize more or less the YAML structure, but you have the Java builder pattern in order to create the specification. And this is interesting because you have already some parsers that exist, and they are not implementing those interfaces. But when you write a tool, in my opinion, you would like to prefer programming against the API that is somehow standard, in order to be able to change the underlying parser implementation. So maybe somebody else will come with a next parser that is better than another one. And if, as a tool writer, you use the API, then you will be able to exchange the implementation. And if you use the Swagger parser and the Swagger core model directly, this is no longer possible. So this is an example of a tool that is doing exactly that. So this is a small style validator that checks if the OpenAPI file is following some rules. And the core library is using the microprofile OpenAPI models, so the interfaces. And the CLI module that these tools provide is using Swagger parser to parse the file. And then there is a small wrapper to wrap the Swagger models into the OpenAPI models, just in case you are interested. I would like to finish the presentation with two more use cases. Like the first one is the OpenAPI Generator that can be used. And the second use case is what we are doing at OnBlue, because I thought maybe it's interesting to have some inputs from a real project that is a little bit more complex than just a small hello world. So the generator, it can be used if you do a specification first approach. So let's imagine you have already a file that you have created with your team, and then you have one team working on the client and one team working on the server. They can use OpenAPI in order to create either the client or the server, or maybe the client team will just use the tool to have a mock of the server until the backend team is ready. This is a lot of scenario where using such a tool makes sense. And for that, I want to have a second small demo. So imagine you have a specification created with a studio. It could be this studio or the Swagger editor or any. You can also type the YAML file by hand. And then you use OpenAPI Generator to generate a Java application. Here I took another application server, which is OpenLibrary, created by IBM, just to also show that not only Quarkus is using this microprofile OpenAPI stuff. So let's switch to the terminal. I hope the demo will work because last time I had some trouble. Where is my mouse? Okay. So now I am using this OpenAPI Generator CLI. I'm telling where my spec is located. Then I say that I want to generate a Jax-RS project using OpenLibrary in this folder. So I just ran that, and now I have the project that was generated here. So if I look at the tree, I get some sources, and I get some configuration for OpenLibrary. If we look at the code, let's switch to Eclipse. I can import the project, so we can have a short look at the code. So this is where my project is located. So I need to wait a little bit. Now the project is created. So now I have a REST application with the API implemented. And because it's just a stub, all the endpoints which just reply with some default logic. And what we can also see is that this is using the file-based approach, where the OpenAPI specification was contributed to the meta-inf folder in order to get more documentation. This is why here I do not have a lot of annotation. All the documentation is done inside the file. So now I can just start the server. And I guess this is the command to start it. Okay. Starting the server. So now if I navigate to this page, or just first ask for the specification, for the OpenAPI specification, the server is running at another port. So yes, it works. I have the OpenAPI specification served now from the OpenLibrary project. And they have also Swagger UI embedded, but the URL is a little bit different. It's OpenAPI/UI. I can refresh the page, and you see really similar to the Quarkus. I get the HTML page describing all the endpoints available on this server, like retrieving to-dos, creating to-dos, and stuff like that. And of course, I can also use one of these elements from my collection. I just need to change the value of the, sorry, it's not here. I just need to change the value because now the port is another one. And if I call this, I get the reply for the moment magic, but now I could kind of work into my code, and instead of that, maybe return a list of entities, because the Java pojos for all the schemas in my OpenAPI specification, they were also generated. That's it for the code first approach, and a few words about what we are doing here at OnBlue. So when I came into the company, they were using some custom JSON that was really close to OpenAPI, but not OpenAPI to describe the API. And there was also a small page generator that was describing all of the services that we provide. And my first job in the company was to change the output, and instead of those two outputs, I added a third one, which is OpenAPI. And we have seen really quickly all the benefits that that you can get when you are using OpenAPI, because the people at QA, they were able to import that to Postman to perform some tests. We were able to generate code, and I will show later how we are using that. We are able to do breaking change detection. So I didn't present this small tool, but this is a way to detect if you have breaking change since the last major version. And in the future, this is not implemented yet, but I plan to replace the static HTML pages into some good-looking documentation created with the Redoc project. And we are using code generation in order to be able to do API versioning. So our vision is that we create one API, open API file per version that we support. So now we are currently finishing the OnBlue 6 release. And with OnBlue 6, we have introduced a new v3 version of the API that have all the bots API that I've presented at the beginning of the talk. But if we have some customers that are doing the migration from OnBlue 4, OnBlue 5, they would like to have a way to do the transition without a big bang and to keep the existing client and webhooks that are interacting with our server. So what we do is that we provide backward compatibility for our API, at least for some major version. At the end, they will have to migrate to the newer one, but we would like to ease the migration and to keep the older version of our API a little bit longer. I think this is a really common pattern that a lot of projects are using. And we are using OpenAPI to solve this problem, because now we are developing OnBlue 6. So we are generating some OpenAPI based on the metadata that we produce with our server. And this creates a small facade for our API, and we are also able to generate test clients for our API in order to run integration tests. But if we take the previous version of OnBlue, there the current version was v2, and we inject that into the OnBlue 6 version by also generating some facade, like we generate the server facade and the test client. And of course, because we might have breaking change, the facade of v2 might require some small adaptation code. This is why I put this gray box. And this is where we do the conversion between some v2 objects that are no longer present when we contact our backend. That's it for my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm not sure if there are any questions now. Otherwise, you can follow me on Twitter and ask me question there.
There
you can
is
also
actually a
see.
question for you.
Okay, so we will see the question. You can also find me on GitHub, and I will put this repository already exists because I've already given this talk or a similar version of this talk previously. But I will update it with the updated code and the updated sample that I've shown today. The question, I need to switch to this screen.
So it's in the Ask a Question tab.
Okay, Ask a Question tab. Where is that?
It's below your screen.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so the question is about an existing Java code. Okay. So this is a Spring backend. So like the microprofile implementation or specification is more for JavaEE based project. And I'm not sure if somebody has provided a kind of a binding to the Spring application. Yes, and so I'm not really familiar with how Spring documentation and the Spring annotation are working, and I know that Spring Fox is something we use when we generate, not we as OnBlue, but the people working with the OpenAPI Generator that are using. So we are using this in order to get self-documentation for the Spring application. I have no direct answer for that because I think Spring Fox would be the way to do so. So, but it's come with somehow other annotation. So I'm not sure how I think we should discuss that probably. Like I'm not sure how to do so because from this question I'm not sure what to answer, but probably we can continue the discussion later.
Okay.
I don't know how the guy can contact me, so I put all the contacts. So the best way is to contact me on Twitter. I really would like to help, but the question is not that concrete, so I cannot. Okay, so contact me on Twitter and we will explore some solution.
Okay, thank you guys so much for joining today's virtual Eclipse community meetup. Thank you, Jeremy, so much for speaking today, and we'll see you guys next time.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.